All right, we're pleased to once again be joined by the man himself, Stephen Lassen, for his weekly appearance on the show. You know him on the Twitter machine at Athlon Stephen. And don't forget to check out his outstanding YouTube channel, All CFB 365. Stephen, how's it going, buddy?
Hey, Mike, it's going great. It's always good to talk to you. Thanks for always having me on every week. And man, I'm sort of depressed because we're winding down the season. We're at the last weekend of October and November is coming up, but we got a lot of exciting matchups. And I think maybe in terms of recent memory, there's a little bit more to play for in the SEC than we're used to. It felt like in previous years you could just go ahead and pencil in Alabama in the West, and you kind of knew what it was in the East as well with Georgia. So I'm looking forward to what should be a pretty entertaining stretch, despite the fact that the season is in its final weeks here.
Yeah, and I couldn't believe it, Stephen, when you reached out this morning with a text just to discuss what we were going to go over on the show. And man, I do not know you, Stephen, to overlook an opponent. You're like the opposite of that. Yet here you are saying we got to talk about this November 5th slate in the SEC. I mean, legitimately, four potential playoff contenders going head to head. How excited? We're going to preview this upcoming week in just a moment, but how excited are you for Alabama at LSU, Tennessee at Georgia?
Oh man, I'm super excited. Like, it doesn't get any better than that because, like you said, I shouldn't look past this weekend, and that could be an interception on my part. But when you can get two matchups featuring top six opponents, I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. And really, the epicenter of college football will be in the SEC that week. Also, a little pet peeve of mine is that when they put games on that are good in the same time slot, and I've got to like work the remote on three different TVs. Like, I'm happy that they're in different time slots so we can enjoy Georgia and Tennessee and Alabama and LSU. And hey, maybe by midnight or so on November 5th, we might know who the front runners are to potentially make the playoff, to win the Heisman Trophy, and to win the divisions in the SEC. So yeah, I'm looking forward to November 5th. It's going to be a good one in the SEC.
Well, let's stay on that topic for just a minute, Stephen. The LSU going into a bye week now, of course, but they just beat Ole Miss, first team to beat Ole Miss, obviously this season. Huge win, signature win of the Brian Kelly era down there in LSU. How surprised are you? Because I know all off season we talked about this being a team that we anticipated would get better as the season went along, but early stumbles right out the gate, really got blown off the field at home against Tennessee. Maybe, we know a little bit more about Tennessee now, so it shouldn't be that surprising. But, I mean, this just been one heck of a midseason turnaround for them Tigers.
It really has. And what's funny is when you step back and you look at LSU's season as a whole, I mean, they were a couple plays away from beating Florida State, and they didn't have a great performance at Auburn on the road. And I almost wonder if that inconsistency is just sort of a hallmark of a team with a first year coach and all of the new pieces. So I think once you kind of get past that inconsistency and you start to drill into the last couple games and see, I mean, scoring over 40 points against Florida, winning like they did on Saturday against Ole Miss, it seems to me that the pieces are starting to fall into place. I've always thought that they would get a lot better from game one to game six, but now we're seeing from game three to game eight, they continue to get better. So I think, like you said, probably the signature win so far of Brian Kelly's tenure, and I think there's still upside for this team. I mean, there's still, you look at the freshmen that are playing on the offensive line. Harold Perkins on defense was instrumental on Saturday against Ole Miss. So Jaden Daniels, he's been locked in the last 2 weeks. If he plays like that, I mean, we know Alabama's had some issues on the road. If Jaden Daniels plays like he did the last 2 weeks, LSU might have a shot on November 5th.
Yeah, and of course it's going to be a night game, nationally televised, so that certainly plays a factor for LSU. But let me ask you about Alabama, Stephen. Nice bounce back performance against Mississippi State. Nearly shut them out, if not for the last play of the game. Saban going nuts on the sideline because there was a damn one of three penalties called on his team. I mean, that was absurd. But they are basically going as far as their outstanding quarterback can take them, the reigning Heisman Trophy winner. But one thing that really stood out to me in that Mississippi State game, Stephen, I don't know about you, but Eli Ricks back on the field after, for whatever reason, not getting much playing time. He looked like a standout. Does that hopefully solve the issues that we saw the Alabama secondary have against a team like Tennessee?
It's a good question because I think going into that Tennessee game, I think Eli Ricks had around 70 snaps for Alabama this year, which just didn't make a lot of sense. I mean, he was a preseason All-American, and we saw this at LSU. His ability, his coverage upside, and this being an All-American caliber talent at LSU. So I've always been a little bit confused as to why he wasn't on the field more for Alabama. I think some of it maybe he just wasn't as familiar with the scheme as some of the other corners. That was sort of the buzz coming out of spring. But I think when you go back and look at that Tennessee game and look forward, it's hard. I don't know. It's hard to read anything into the Mississippi State game because they've dominated that series so much since Mike Leach has gotten there. But I do think that getting Ricks out there can help solve some of the secondary concerns that Alabama had from Tennessee. Tennessee really did a nice job of getting Alabama's safeties in really bad spots too. So I think it's a part of the solution. It's also hard for me to read too much into it just because, Mike Leach's offenses have struggled against Alabama. So I think it's a net positive for Alabama, but to be determined whether or not it gets the secondary fully back on track. I will say one other thing about that game on Saturday. I actually I thought my stats were broken watching that game. Alabama, I had to look at the game and see that Alabama was outgained by Mississippi State. So, the offense just going kind of quiet in the second half was a little odd. And I think that's something that when they come out of the bye week at LSU, at Ole Miss, we know the road struggles that they've had. I think they're going to have to get some of those younger receivers up to speed a little bit more, whether that's Kobe Prentice, Isaiah Bond. So if you're Alabama, the talent is there, the pieces are there. The off week might be a good time to reset and figure some of these things out.
Now, as long as Tennessee and Georgia, which they got conference games, we're going to break down in just a moment, but as long as they take care of business, they're going to set up the game of the year in the SEC in Athens, SEC on CBS, nationally televised, of course. We've kind of hit on it, but do you think that Georgia will be able to limit or at least slow down Hendon Hooker in this Josh Heupel offense?
I think so. I mean, I trust Kirby Smart having a couple weeks to get ready to figure some things out. When you look at Georgia from a defensive standpoint this year, I mean, Tennessee is going to be the best team that they faced offensively so far. Hendon Hooker, the best quarterback. Also, if the counter to that would be, hey, if you're Tennessee, nobody's really slowed this offense down all year, and they just torched Alabama when Cedric Tillman wasn't playing. So if you add him back to the mix, it only gets more difficult to slow down Tennessee. I think if you're Georgia, the argument would be, hey, we get Tennessee in Athens. Last year Tennessee started fast. Georgia figured things out. Maybe Georgia has a healthy Jalen Carter. And I think just seeing what happened to Alabama, I think Georgia, that having that time to prepare will probably work in their favor. So I think you can slow Tennessee down. I think the question is going to be whether you can get enough stops to do so. And then for Georgia, the biggest thing for them on offense, and we'll talk about this, is efficiency. But they're going to need some big plays, I think, to beat Tennessee in a couple weeks.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Stephen, because that's right where I wanted to go. Just the way college football is right now, a lot of your success is down to two key factors, in my opinion: explosive plays, which goes to the efficiency you were just talking about, and converting in the red zone. And both of those are issues that Georgia has had this season. And they've not really faced anyone, Stephen, that is of their caliber. Now, maybe you could argue Oregon, and they beat the hell out of them. And so we have to give them credit for that. They certainly were outstanding in that game. But I mean, since that time, I don't know they've played an opponent that can touch them. Now that we're in the back half here, we got Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi State, which is hit or miss Obviously, Florida with Anthony Richardson. Maybe if Superman comes out there, but is that a concern of yours that Georgia is lacking in explosive plays and struggling in the red zone?
Yeah, it really is because I don't think you can trade field goals for touchdowns and beat Tennessee. If you think about it like this, Tennessee gets 3 touchdowns, Georgia kicks 3 field goals, you're already down 21-9. I mean, that's a bad formula. It needs to be reversed if you're Georgia. You need to make Tennessee kick field goals and you need to score touchdowns. You're right about how college football is played. I mean, look at the rules, with targeting the man downfield. It is very geared towards offenses, quarterbacks, and receiver play. Tennessee excels at this year. Alabama's doing it with Bryce Young. If you're Georgia, I think one of the keys to the next half of the season is going to be, can they get some guys back to receiver? They really need Mitchell and Arian Smith, the speed threats on the outside, to get back and more involved in this offense and open some of those things up. There's something to be said about efficiency. You want to be able to get the chunk plays and have the good success rate, getting 3 to 4 yards consistently. But if you're Georgia and you look at that matchup, I mean, can you nickel and dime Tennessee while they're trading big plays on offense? It's going to be a fun case study to see how that matches up. So I'm really looking forward to that game. And I think the question that I've been wanting to know about Georgia since the Oregon game is the inconsistency that we've seen since then. They have all the pieces to put it together and win the national title. And I think the question for me is going to be, do they put the pedal down and do all those pieces start to fall in place? And it has to start this Saturday and then with Tennessee coming up as well.
Mm. Well, I should probably, I apologize, Stephen. Probably should have prepared you, but when we sit here and chat, I get things come to my head. But let me just ask you this, because if my memory's correct, when Josh Heupel was at Central Florida, one team that really had his number, if I'm not mistaken, was Cincinnati with Luke Fickell's defense. And so anything stand out to you there? And then obviously they're running, Art Briles, Baylor offense, heavily influenced Josh Heupel and his current system. So if nothing about those Cincinnati matchups, anything, anybody that slowed down that Baylor system, does anything stand out to you? Because I'm just curious why the rest of the SEC has yet to catch up to this offense. Is it because of Hendon Hooker is so efficient, or is there anything that comes to your mind of how SEC defenses like a Kentucky, like a Georgia, can slow it down?
I almost think it has to be a offense has to help the defense, because one game that stood out to me this year was Kentucky when they beat Mississippi State. I mean, Mississippi State didn't run many plays. They couldn't get the offense going because they never had the ball. And I think if you're Georgia, we talk about efficiency, and you are going to want to play kind of a more of a ball control style. Like Alabama traded punches with Tennessee and came up just short. I think Georgia might be better served to say, let's slow this game down. Let's get the small efficiency. Let's also hit a few chunk plays. Let's try to defend Hendon Hooker for 60 plays as opposed to 80. And I think to your point, I think on how difficult it is to defend. I mean, the way that Tennessee has its offense structured just makes it so hard, because we see how the wide splits where the receivers are, they're all the way out to the boundary. Your defense is so spread out. Well, if you try to defend the boundary, Hendon Hooker can just take off and run. Tennessee's offensive line is better. They're running the ball a little bit better this year too. So I think some of it is Tennessee has just morphed into a really hard to stop offense this year. Maybe you look at Pitt as a team this year who got some success getting to Hendon Hooker like that. It's one of those battles too, because even if you can get pressure, he's just so good at getting rid of the ball quick. They can run some RPOs and all that. So the chess match and trying to slow these offenses down is just such an interesting discussion. I think if I was a coach, I would want to just try to play keep away and then try to create some havoc, try to get them off the field on third down and get some pressure, because I think that's probably the only way you're going to be able to slow them down at this point.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, Stephen, Alabama should fire Saban for Pat Narduzzi if they ever want to beat Josh Heupel.
Man, I got to tell you, I don't know if you've watched many Pitt games this year, but I don't think you want to watch many Pitt games this year, because Narduzzi fired his offense, or he didn't fire Mark Whipple. Mark Whipple left to go to Nebraska, but he didn't like the way the offense was because they didn't run the ball enough, and they weren't cautious enough. So if you ever want to, if you're rooting for like a college football sicko bowl game, it would be Iowa and Pitt playing like a 3-0 special at some point.
All right, let's shift gears, Steven, to this upcoming week. What's the best game, best matchup, do you think, in your opinion, in the SEC? Every game on the docket is a conference game, so this is always the best weekends in the SEC. But what's the top matchup in your mind?
I think I don't know if it'll necessarily be close, but I think it's because of the things that we talked about is Florida and Georgia. I mean, first of all, it's just the rivalry between these two, the scene in Jacksonville, everything about it. I just love watching this game every year. But also, I'm curious to see when Florida has played teams like Utah and they played Tennessee. You mentioned it, Anthony Richardson was Superman. And I'm interested to see if they get that kind of performance off a bye week where he's had a couple, weeks to get healthy. They're going to need him to have one of those caliber performances to win. And I think on the other side of things for Georgia, and they have all these talented pieces on offense and defense, and everything is there to win it all again. And this is the key stretch. Do they start to piece this together and make that run towards the national championship? So I think some of this is just seeing Georgia off the bye week and how they come together going forward. Do we see that dominant team that we saw against Oregon show up in Jacksonville, show up against Tennessee, or do we see that inconsistent team? And also, it's Billy Napier's first kind of game against Georgia, so I think there's a chance for Florida, even if you don't win, to have a good showing. It'd be important for recruiting and, of course, everything else.
Eh, I would assume Florida's got no prayer in this matchup if Anthony Richardson is not on point with his passing game. Do you think that's fair to say?
I agree with you. I think when you look at this matchup, if you're Georgia, I think the key ought to be stop the run, keep Richardson in the pocket, and force this game to be won through the air by Florida. And I think there's a fair question of whether Florida's got enough weapons in the passing game to be able to do so. Like if you're Florida, if you can get some things going on the ground, Richardson makes a couple plays, maybe you can kind of hang in this game. Also, I think we saw Missouri and Kent State both give Georgia trouble in doing some different things. Missouri was really aggressive at the line of scrimmage. So I think if you're Florida, can you create some havoc against the running game of Georgia? Get them in those long yardage situations. We talked about their efficiency, which has been great. But if you're not hitting big plays, if you're in 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8, you still have to cover Brock Bowers. You still have to cover Darnell Washington. You have to try and stop him. But I would take my chances in 3rd and long as opposed to being sort of 3rd and 2, the 3rd and 1s, where it's really easy for that ground game to get going.
Do you buy anything, Stephen, into just the series history that there's been a lot of weird games? I mean, we've seen like undefeated Florida lose to Georgia. We've seen really good Georgia teams go down here and just for the life of them cannot get over the Florida Gators. I realize, the different teams, different coaching staffs, all that. But do you think that the series history and just the uniqueness of it can lend itself to these, upsets we don't see coming, or not even necessarily upset? Because by God, Stephen, anytime I suggest Georgia might lose a game, I just got to hear about it all damn week. But maybe I'm just saying to make this a competitive ball game, which the point spread is what, 3 touchdowns. So do you buy into that at all?
I think when you look at the series trend, Georgia has won 4 out of the last 5, and 3 of those were decided by double digits. So the series has been trending very heavy in Georgia's favor. But I think to your point, Georgia's had kind of those performances against Missouri this year and, against Kent State where they haven't been firing on all cylinders. And if that Georgia team shows up, could Florida make this a lot more interesting? Yeah, they could. I think 22 points is a lot for a rivalry game. And especially when you've had both teams with 2 weeks to get ready. And I think that's kind of one of the X factors to me is if you're Billy Napier, what can you throw at Georgia off a bye week that you haven't shown this year? You've got Anthony Richardson, hopefully healthy to be able to go out and keep this game competitive. So anytime when I see a rivalry, I'm kind of optimistic that brings out the best in the underdog. But on paper, I think it's hard to make a case that Florida can win this game. And of course, that'll be on a cold takes if that works out that way.
How paramount is it that Florida gets off to a hot start? I mean, I know they did against LSU and it didn't help, but I don't want to compare Georgia to A&M, but hell, we'll get to A&M in a moment here, but we saw their the opposite of a hot start against South Carolina, and they just caved with all that young talent. But Georgia, again, I don't want to compare the two, but they are loaded with a lot of young talent, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. You know, if Florida maybe finds some success early, I don't want to say they'll get rattled because I don't think that's going to happen. But I don't know, just maybe gives Florida a little hope. And because if I'm Georgia, I want to come out here and just step on their throat right away, just to finish them early if possible.
I completely agree with you. I think if you're Georgia, you want to come out and make a statement on Saturday. And some of the things that we've talked about, they some doubts about whether Georgia can get back to the national championship game. Are they looking ahead to Tennessee next week? I think if you're Georgia, you just come out and say, hey, we're the best team in college football. We're going to come out and dominate for 60 minutes. We're going to put away a rival and we're going to win easily. And I think if you're Florida, I think the flip side of that is nobody believes you can win. You're a 22, 23-point dog. And it's in a rivalry game. So I think if Florida can have some success early, and frankly, shouldn't Florida be able to play a little bit looser? Like they have nothing to lose here. They're a heavy underdog. They should lose this game. Throw everything out there. If you can maybe shell shock Georgia a little bit and maybe pull off an early lead, maybe this gets a little bit more interesting. But I think to your point, I think they got to get off to a good start because I don't think Florida can rally from a 24-7 type of deficit.
Yeah. Oh, and I kind of forgot to mention this, Steven. So, but looking ahead, again, we probably shouldn't do this to Tennessee, Georgia. But after this week of games, the initial playoff poll will be released. I realize, people get fixated on the rankings, and I don't even like to go down that rabbit hole, to be honest with you, but it's unique because Tennessee's, if they win on Saturday, they're going to be in that top four. Would you have Georgia number one, or would you have Tennessee if they both, let's assume they both win comfortably, which is, they're probably both going to lose now since I just said that, but let's assume they win comfortably on Saturday. Would you have Georgia or Tennessee ranked higher in the playoff poll?
Can't wait for Mike and Steven to be on the Freezing Cold Takes Twitter account come Sunday. Oh man, we're just gearing it up. I would have Tennessee. I think they've got the best win of the season so far by beating Alabama. Is Tennessee the best team on a neutral field? I would probably lean no. I think Georgia's probably better. But I think Tennessee's got the best win. And at this point of the season, when we don't have complete resumes, I'll default to Tennessee. Now, also acknowledging that the Oregon win looks better and better for Georgia every week. I mean, Oregon beat UCLA on Saturday. Oregon's comfortably in the top 10. So it is a good back and forth. But hey, the best thing is they're going to play on November 5th. And after that, any kind of ranking discussion becomes moot because they're going to play and the head-to-head winner will be ranked ahead come after that.
Yeah, but I had a follow up on there because Stephen, I think you're 100% right. I think Tennessee would get the nod, but I would also ask you this, Stephen. Don't you think that's a damn worst thing that can happen to the Vols going into Georgia they're going to be, we're the reigning champs, we're undefeated, and they rank this team over us. I mean, if that happens, Georgia may win by 20 in Athens,
Oh, you know it. Kirby's going to play this up. That Georgia's going to play the disrespect card, and they should. I mean, they would be, probably number 2 or number 3 if both teams win this week. They can say, hey, we beat Oregon. I guess we're not any good. We're behind Tennessee. So 110%, Mike. You know that they are going to play the disrespect card on November 5th if Tennessee is ahead in the polls for sure.
All right, so let's talk of that one next, Stephen. Kentucky at Tennessee. Man, this has been a really good series in recent years. Tennessee thinks they're above Kentucky. Kentucky thinks they've caught up to Tennessee, at least recently. I mean, Kentucky's certainly had more success than the Vols. They've been kind of going back and forth. It's always funny, though, Stephen. It's the 10-win Kentucky that can't get over Tennessee for some damn reason. But, Kentucky's getting, I don't want to say hot at the right time, but they're kind of finding themselves at the right time going into this critical stretch. Just pulled the upset over Mississippi State. How confident are you that Kentucky can make us a ball game in Neyland Stadium?
The first thing I was going to say, I was going to see if Mark Stoops was going to channel Matt Rourke this week to come back and maybe give the speech to get Kentucky ready for Tennessee. But I think when I start studying this game, I go back to the Mississippi State game for Kentucky because that's how they're going to need to play to win this game. They're going to have to make it really ugly because I don't think they want to get into a shootout with Tennessee. I don't think Kentucky's going to be able to trade 45-40 kind of a game. Now, last year's game was pretty wild and that was fun. But I think if you're Kentucky, the formula has to be Chris Rodriguez and that offensive line gets a good push. We saw this against Mississippi State. I think they won time of possession like 40 minutes to 20 minutes. And time of possession doesn't necessarily mean anything. But I think if you're Kentucky, if you can take Hendon Hooker, the more you can keep him off the field and keep Will Levis and the offensive line on the field, that's a win for Kentucky. So I look for Kentucky to try to win this game along the line of scrimmage, keep Hendon Hooker on the sidelines, make it ugly. The lower scoring game, the better for Kentucky. Also, if you're Tennessee, don't look past Kentucky to get to Georgia. You got to take care of business on Saturday first.
Yeah, and last season, Stephen, I mean, I think it was Tennessee scored in like 5 plays, 2 touchdowns. I mean, it was incredible. They just came out and just embarrassed Kentucky's defense. How does a result like that going to motivate this team? Because this is, I realize Kentucky a little disappointing, but hell, they still got, they could run the table. If it's obviously got to start here, but if they beat Tennessee, there's no reason they can't beat Georgia at home. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I would buy it. So, how much motivation do they got going in after getting their ass kicked, especially on defense? And defense has been pretty good for Kentucky this year.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, to me, that's the formula for Kentucky. I mean, you look at their stats this year, they've been pretty good on third downs, red zone, and not giving up big plays. Now, facing the Mississippi State, facing Tennessee, a little bit different challenge. Tennessee is going to challenge you downfield a lot more than what Mississippi State did. So the challenge and the matchups are a little bit different. But, I think Kentucky, they ought to be motivated and ready for this game because when you mentioned the schedule, at Missouri, Vanderbilt, Georgia, and Louisville the rest of the way. So if they can win this game, certainly going into Knoxville and winning, and then later in the year playing Georgia at home, you can beat Tennessee. Georgia and Lexington is also winnable. So I know Kentucky's a 12.5 point dog here, but I also think that there's some things that they can do to at least make this game interesting, I think.
Do you think Kentucky's the more motivated team going into this matchup?
I would think it's probably Tennessee. I mean, there's Tennessee's rolling right now. I mean, when even heck, I mean Princeton advanced throwing touchdown passes against Tennessee. I mean, they're just rolling right now on offense, and they could get Cedric Tillman back maybe in some capacity. I know that there's the look ahead factor here for Tennessee, but they've just met the challenge every time this year. There was the game against LSU before Alabama. There was the Florida, when he played Florida, was there any look ahead, any kind of hangover? There hasn't been any. So I think with the rivalry and also what's at stake for Tennessee, I would suspect that they will probably be more motivated, but I think it's going to be probably pretty equal here too, because Mark Stoops off a bye week where he and Brad White have had 2 weeks to get something ready for Tennessee should make this game, I think, interesting on Saturday night.
Yeah, and I got to start giving Tennessee's defense more credit for stopping the run. I kind of credit that more to teams being able to take advantage of them through the air. But man, when you're limiting Alabama, of course they got Jahmyr Gibbs. He's going to get his, but they've been limiting the vast majority of their teams they play on the ground. If they limit Chris Rodriguez and this inconsistent Kentucky offensive line, does Kentucky even have a shot in this game?
Well, I think they might be able to because I think you can move the ball. I mean, I think we've seen it. Tennessee secondary is a liability right now, and of course they've been down some players too. But I think Kentucky, you want to avoid negative plays, and you don't want to be trying to win out of like 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9 all night long. Will Levis having 2 weeks to get healthy, I think, is a big deal for this game, and also Kentucky's got the playmakers. Barian Brown and Key and Tavion Robinson, if he can get back healthy. I mean, those 3 receivers can give Tennessee's secondary a lot of trouble, but I still think you don't want to get into a shootout with Tennessee. I think if you're Kentucky, you can probably use the passing game to sort of control time of possession too. But without a running game, I think Kentucky's got to get Chris Rodriguez going to some extent to be able to win on Saturday.
How much, I don't know, pressure is the right word, but how much does Will Levis have to gain? Because, like you said, everybody's talking Tennessee, Hendon Hooker, Heisman, all this. But it was Will Levis getting all the offseason hype. And, could not that doing this against Tennessee is going to help his NFL stock or anything, but it would kind of, people that are not sold on Will Levis yet, they may start to come around. Do you think he stands a lot to gain in this game? Or do you think that maybe for him, it's more about the Georgia game?
It's probably Georgia, but I don't think it hurts on the road at Tennessee to have a big performance. I mean, if he goes in on Saturday and throws for 300 yards, a couple touchdowns, Kentucky loses, but it's close. It's obviously going to reflect really well on him, and it could even look better if Kentucky's offensive line and running game is just stuffed all night. So, I think there's something to gain here for Kentucky because it felt like when they came off the off week, they could really put some things together based upon how the offensive line played against Mississippi State. Their defense, of course, is one of the better groups in the SEC. If they can put all this together, they have the potential to finish fast. And of course, Levis is a big part of that. And I think even though they need to run the ball, he's going to have to be a big part of what happens on Saturday if Kentucky has any shot to win.
How does Kentucky's secondary match up against this receiving core with, like, we're kind of assuming Cedric Tillman may not be 100%, but we anticipate he's going to give it a go this weekend, adding him to the mix for Tennessee?
Yeah, Kentucky's second in the SEC in pass efficiency defense. The counter to that would be when you look at some of the passing games that they faced this year. Yes, they faced Mississippi State, but again, I think it's such a unique challenge of trying to play Tennessee with the array of weapons that they have, and then also try to defend up front. It'd be a little different story if Tennessee's wasn't able to run the ball as effectively. Maybe if Hendon Hooker wasn't as mobile, you could defend them differently. So, I mean, Kentucky from a defensive perspective this year has been very good. I think we'll just find out how good they are on Saturday. And a part of that is, like we talked about, they're going to need help from the offense. I mean, the defense just is going to they're going to have to play a little bit of keep away to protect the defense of Kentucky. So I'm excited to see how all those pieces that we talked about in the offseason in the secondary, this will be by far their toughest test of the season.
All right, how about this matchup, Stephen? A lot of intrigue. Ole Miss on the road at Texas A&M. Ole Miss, they opened as a slight favorite, but this is like our weekly conversation, Stephen. What in the hell is going on at College Station? I mean, what do they do here? Do they play the freshmen? Every quarterback they play, they're getting them killed because they can't block. So I don't know if I'm hearing a lot of people say we got to play Connor Wigman, see what we got, and I think maybe you do because you got to have some hope for the future. But how good can he play if he's getting killed back here? What would you do to help this offense?
Yeah, not to mention a couple offensive linemen are now out for the year, including Bryce Foster. That's a pretty big deal for Texas A&M. Mike, I hate to use this on your podcast, but WTF? Like, what was that? I mean, you come out off of an off week and to start to be down 17-0 and to look that poor, to use time, a couple timeouts just to kick a field goal. I mean, it was the worst possible performance that A&M could have had off an off week and in a game that they were favored in at South Carolina. So, I mean, I don't mean to pick on A&M and don't mean to be too negative towards to A&M, but obviously I think to your point, there's a very broader issue here of like, how does A&M move forward with all these question marks? And I think you have to start selling something for 2023, and it is the young quarterback. I think you know what you have in Haynes King. I think you know what you have in Max Johnson. I think Connor Wigman, you got to see whether or not he's the guy or not. We're not going to know a whole lot because the injuries on the offensive line, I think the OL run blocking, pass blocking just hasn't been as good as we expected maybe coming into the season. So the fixes aren't coming this year. But I think if you're A&M, if you want to start looking ahead, you have guys at receiver, you have some good tight ends, you have good running backs. The pieces are there for this offense. If they can get somebody to take over the play calling duties from Jimbo Fisher, hire a better offensive line coach. This group has talent, and the way to move forward in 2023 is through that. So I think you also have to start thinking that if you play Connor Wigman and he struggles, maybe you have to dip into the portal again for another quarterback too. So I think that's part of it for me is you know what you got in the other guys. You got to find out what you have in the freshmen. You're not going to learn everything. But at this point of the year, you got to give hope for 2023, and that's one way to do it.
The one thing they do got down there in A&M is a defense, so we give them that. I mean, they kept them in that damn game, nearly won it, despite being in a 17-0 hole right out the gate. But how does this defense match up against Lane Kiffin's offense, which finally kind of met its match against LSU? Zach Evans being out certainly helped LSU's defense. It remains to be seen if Zach Evans is going to play in this one. But how does the defense match up against what Ole Miss is going to want to do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because when you look at A&M from a statistical standpoint, they have struggled against the run this year. I don't think that they are necessarily as bad as those numbers have indicate. I mean, they've got good players and they've got potential some standouts, young players, especially in the front seven. So I think to me, if you're looking at A&M, the way to win this game is to do what LSU did. And LSU shut down, Judkins, and of course Evans didn't play. Ole Miss had the fewest rushing yards they've had all season. So I think you have to shut down the run and force Jackson Dart to beat you through the air. A&M secondary has been great this year. So to me, this game is really right about up front. If you're A&M, make Jackson Dart beat you through the air, stop the run, kind of like what LSU did, and keep it a lower scoring game. Because if you are going to the young quarterback and you got some offensive things, question marks going on, you can't get into a back and forth affair here for Ole Miss. And I think if you're Lane Kiffin, I think you would probably welcome a higher scoring game because that means that you're moving the ball and you're forcing A&M to get out of its comfort zone. I mean, A&M hasn't scored more than 24 points against an FBS team in one calendar year now. So higher scoring game would really benefit Ole Miss.
Yeah. Well, how concerned are you though that the Ole Miss defense, maybe this is the ideal matchup for Texas A&M's offense because their defense is starting to cave a little bit. Are you concerned about that side of the ball for Ole Miss?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, they're also too they're beat up on defense. I mean, they had some guys get hurt against LSU. I was also this slipped past me that Ole Miss will have the latest bye week of any team in the SEC. I mean, they have to play this game against Texas A&M, and then they get the off week before the final three games of the season. So I think if you're Ole Miss at this point of the season, you've played, 8 straight games and going into your ninth matchup on the road, and especially in the SEC where games like this can really take their toll. So, Ole Miss really needs to get to the bye week, but also I think on defense, I mean, they are starting to be a little bit more leaky than they were earlier in the season. So A&M is really going to have to get the ball to A-Chain on the ground, test that Ole Miss front, see if some of these injuries, see if the recent plays start to catch up. Auburn moved the ball on the ground well against Ole Miss. And with a young quarterback, I think that's where I would try to run my offense through on Saturday.
What's your thoughts on the progression of Jackson Dart? I realize he didn't quite get it done, lost by 20 plus points at LSU, but it seems to me, Stephen, like he is a much better player now than he was at the beginning of the season. It's almost like what A&M fans are hoping they can get out of Wigman would just improve, and then maybe by next year he's one of the more promising quarterbacks in the SEC. I can see that path for him. What about you?
I agree with you. I think that's one thing that stood out to me early on in Saturday's game is I thought he looked way more comfortable than he did at the start of the year. Now I know LSU adjusted and they figured some things out and they slowed down Ole Miss and the pass rush of LSU gave Dart and the offensive line a lot of trouble, but he looked a lot better to me. And I think if you're Ole Miss, I think you could make a pretty reasonable case that, hey, they might be ahead of schedule with all the new pieces and the turnover from last year. Maybe they're a little bit ahead of schedule. And if they finish this year 9-3, maybe even 10-2, you bring in another class through the portal, you could even push that higher with one of the potentially better quarterbacks in the SEC in Jackson Dart. So I think he's on the right track as far as his improvement. I would also like to see, if I'm Ole Miss, some other receivers step up. I mean, they've got 3 guys who are really kind of dominating the catches. think they need a little bit more depth. And of course, Michael Trigg getting hurt was a big problem for that offense. So there's some things they can do to help him, but I also think that he's definitely on the right track.
Any added intrigue in this matchup, Stephen, given the fact that Lane Kiffin and DJ Durkin will be kind of, playing that chess game after spending 2 years together in Oxford?
Oh yeah, and I'm also setting my Twitter account for notifications on Lane Kiffin after the back and forth between he and Fisher earlier this offseason about NIL. So I look forward to the post game shenanigans between those two. But yeah, I mean, the coaches know each other, and I think that's what adds some intrigue here for me, because you know that this game is probably it's almost like weakness versus weakness and strength versus strength. Ole Miss defensively has been struggling the last couple weeks. We know A&M has issues on offense. You've got the high-powered Ole Miss offense against a pretty good A&M defense. So that if A&M is going to win this game, it's probably going to have to be through DJ Durkin and that defense kind of keeping Ole Miss in check, and then A-Chain having a big day on offense.
Yeah. All right. How about Arkansas at Auburn, Stephen? Arkansas coming off a bye. Both these teams, excuse me, coming off a bye. But Arkansas opened as a 5-point favorite. That was kind of surprising to me. If you look at the recent history, Auburn, their longest winning streak over an SEC opponent is against Arkansas, although some questionable calls helped that streak stay alive. But Auburn, they can't stop the run, and Arkansas loves the run. So this could be a huge mismatch in at least that aspect of the game in my mind. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say I don't think we need to remind Arkansas fans too much about 2020, that season, that game at Auburn. But 1998 was the last time that Arkansas was favored over Auburn at Auburn. So it's been a long time since they've been favored on the road here. But I like this matchup for Arkansas. I know Auburn's also coming off a bye. I expect both teams to have some new things to throw out there. But I thought Arkansas, much like we talked about with Ole Miss just a minute ago, they needed that bye week. I mean, there's so many guys beat up in the secondary. KJ Jefferson was banged up, bumps and bruises all kind of all across the roster. Looks like they may get some guys back in the secondary, which is a huge plus. But you mentioned the matchups. I mean, to me, this matchup plays well for Arkansas. I think you can run on this Auburn defense. Auburn's weakness on offense: 10 interceptions, 5 touchdown passes this year. They're not great at throwing it. Arkansas's secondary is an issue. This is a better matchup for Arkansas when you have to go up against a team that's struggling to throw it. And I think you can slow down the running game of Bigsby and Hunter just enough if you're Arkansas.
Yeah, so you just kind of hit on what I was going to ask you next, Stephen. I mean, Auburn's going to get theirs, I would think, in the passing game just based on how weak Arkansas has been. But at the same point, they don't really have the quarterback or receivers to really do a ton of damage against anybody, do they?
Right. I think that's the big question here is, Robbie Ashford as completing, like 52 for 50% of his passes this year. And the playmakers for Auburn this year, the receivers are a big question. So if you're Arkansas, you're looking at this going, if we can slow down Bigsby and we can slow down Hunter and we can get some pressure, in which I think you can do against Auburn's offensive line, you can get them sort of off schedule and get them in those third and longs and asking them to execute. Like, even if Arkansas gives up a big play or two, are you willing to take your chances that Auburn's passing game can consistently hit all Saturday? I would if I was Barry Odom. So I suspect that this could be a really good game for Drew Sanders stopping the run on Saturday against Auburn. So I think this matchup really favors what the Razorbacks do well in defense. And also, I'm not sure I trust Auburn's passing game to be able to hit consistently enough, even against a questionable Arkansas secondary.
Well, we got to give Auburn a little bit of credit, Stephen. I mean, clearly they have not given up, and their offense, probably their best game was the last one against Ole Miss. But we are well past the point of moral victories for the Tigers. I mean, they lost that damn game. They did give LSU, what were they up, like 17-0, 14-0, something against LSU, which is all suddenly red hot. So Auburn is playing better now than they were early. But does that give you any optimism that at least at home maybe they can pull out what would be an upset here against Arkansas?
Absolutely. I think that's something that stood out to me the last couple weeks is Auburn could have packed it in because the way the season's going, I think we all know what's going to happen in a few weeks with the coaching staff. They could have packed it in because there's if they don't win this game, it's really hard to chart a path to bowl eligibility. And even if they win this game, it's going to be hard to get to a bowl game. So I think at this point, you're playing just to try to get to 6-6, and you're also trying to, potentially impress the next coaching staff. So I think if you're an Auburn fan, the biggest reason for optimism is, hey, this team hasn't packed it in all season. Arkansas hasn't, the way this we've dominated this series. Arkansas secondary is vulnerable. Maybe we can hit a few big plays. If we can slow down KJ Jefferson and Sanders just enough, we got a chance. And Auburn just played pretty well at Ole Miss a few weeks ago. So I think the point spread hovering around 4 or 5 points makes sense considering that Auburn is not packed it in for this season.
But also on the flip side, maybe it's BYU and their defense. You could fill us in with knowledge on BYU a lot more than I could. But Arkansas, their most dominant offensive performance was in their last game against BYU. If they could carry over that momentum, you gotta like Arkansas's chances to win this game, right?
Absolutely. And not only this game, I think when you look forward, I mean, Liberty, LSU, and Ole Miss all coming up in Fayetteville, followed by Missouri at the season finale in Missouri. So I really like the potential for Arkansas to potentially go on a run here to close the season. If they can pick up where they left off, I think BYU's defense is pretty bad, especially against the run. I thought it was a good matchup for Arkansas, but I think the schedule sets up well. And also, I think coming off the off week where Arkansas can get some guys healthy and KJ Jefferson can get back to 100% is really big for this team. I mean, they played some really tough games with A&M. They had to play Mississippi State without KJ Jefferson, and then, of course, the Alabama game. So I think if you're Arkansas, if you can pick up where you left off and you can be a little bit better on defense, there's a lot of winnable games here in the last 5 weeks of the season.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about this, Stephen, and this has got nothing to do with this game in particular, but Auburn, man, those fans have just got, very little to hold their head high about the last year and a half, really. So, I'm not trying to pile on them or anything, but is there reason to believe? I mean, you look around and you see what Sam Pittman's done at Arkansas. You see what Josh Heupel's done. You see what Brian Kelly's done. Is there reason to believe? I mean, they got one of the best fan bases in the country. They got one of the best home fields. This is one of the elite programs in the country. If they get a quality hire in there with the portal, with the NIL, they got some mega boosters down there, Steven. They could be your best friends or your worst enemies, but I got to assume the next coach, they're going to be aligned with that. Is there, a chance that Auburn, I'm not saying they're going to compete for the SEC next season, but, within a year or two, could be the Auburn that we know and love competing for West titles?
100%. I don't expect Auburn to be down very long at all. And especially with whoever the new coach is, I think you'll start to see Auburn could be very active in the portal for quick roster fixes. And we've seen, other teams in the SEC, like you mentioned, Arkansas, Tennessee's dipped into the portal. I think Auburn would be a pretty attractive place. I mean, you mentioned it, the NIL. I think there's potential to come in and play right away. They're going to need guys to come in and play right away on the offensive line for sure next year. Could also be a pretty attractive spot for a quarterback to come in and play next year too. So I don't suspect Auburn will be very down for very long. I know they weren't very good last year. And of course, they're probably not going to make a bowl this year. But if I'm an Auburn fan, I think just hang in there to 2023, 2024. I think things will get better. Also, too, I mean, Auburn they continue, like we said, to be competitive. And if you can get a new staff and a fresh start and bring in some talent to the portal, I mean, the gap between Auburn and some of these other teams that they're fighting for, sixth, fifth, and fourth in the West is not that wide right now. So they could get better a lot right away with the right coach and the right portal approach.
This just came to me, Stephen. Jeff Brom to Auburn. Who says no?
Hey, that's actually a pretty good idea. I mean, number one, you get a coach that knows offense, which he'd run a fun style, and it would cause coaches like Nick Saban a lot of trouble. Also, he's really good at like maximizing talent. There are guys who have come through Purdue who are walk-ons who ended up being pretty significant contributors the last couple of years. So I think when you're discussing potential candidates, if I'm an Auburn fan, yeah, I would have Brom pretty high on my list just because he knows how to build high-powered offenses. Our discussion earlier about the game is, you have to be able to play offense and recruit quarterbacks and receivers. He's pretty high up there on my list of favorite offenses to watch and coaches who could really put something together fast.
All right, final matchup here, Stephen. Missouri at South Carolina. South Carolina suddenly red hot after beating A&M, winning what is it, 4 in a row, first time under Shane Beamer. And Missouri, heck, they got they broke their losing streak. They got an SEC game. It was ugly. They came out and dominated the first half. They nearly gave it away in the second half. Thoughts on this matchup?
I think another opportunity for South Carolina to keep going forward. I know that seems kind of basic, but I think if you're South Carolina, you've now pieced together a few wins. We've talked the last couple of weeks about the opportunity in front of them with Missouri, with Vanderbilt, with Florida coming up. They could really string together some wins. Also, they could play spoiler because they get Tennessee and they get Clemson later this year. So I think if you're South Carolina, it's all about building something and continuing the progression. I would say if I'm South Carolina, you've got to continue to get Marshawn Lloyd more involved. I feel like we say that every week, but when I was watching the game on Saturday, I was like, did Marcus Satterfield forget that Marshawn Lloyd existed for a while? But no, I think South Carolina is trending in the right direction. This would be another good opportunity for them to do so, and what should be a very winnable game and to get that winning streak to 5.
Well, I asked Cousin Shane this on the Monday show, Stephen. I'm going to ask you, and this may sound totally bizarre, and I'm not even trying to be hot takeish here, but you won 4 in a row. There's a good chance you can win 6 in a row. Can you fire an offensive coordinator after winning 4 to 6 games in a row? Because hell, like you, I mean, again, I'm trying not to pile on, but it seems like you said, we're saying the same thing every week. It's almost like their offensive game plan is holding them back here.
Yeah, I think you can. I think for South Carolina to take that next step, they're going to need more out of their offense. Clayton White's done a nice job with the defense. They've had some personnel shortages at certain spots, when he took over. And of course, this season, there's still a group that's evolving. But he's done a really nice job on defense. Pete Limbo and Shane Beamer, of course, doing a really nice job on special teams. One way to make up some deficiencies everywhere else is to be great on special teams, and they've done that. So I think Saturday's game against A&M was kind of a little clarifying that when the staff is doing everything right for the most part, other than some of those things on offense, but they're really, they're really resourceful. They're getting the most, I think, out of this roster, with the exception of some things on offense. So I think regardless of how the season plays out, and I've been Mr. Patience, but I think South Carolina needs to make a change to offensive coordinator to be able to move forward.
Now, what are the odds you give Missouri to? Remember, they beat South Carolina last year. They have surprised people in the past, and man, at least they finally got off the schneid, losing these tight ball games. They finally won a tight ball game. It's got to be maddening to be a Missouri fan at this point in time because you don't know what you're getting week in and week out. But and I hate to put it on any one player, but it seems like if they could get a little bit more consistency at quarterback and particularly on the offensive line, which obviously those are two big issues, but it seems like if we had that solved, we'd have a quality team here in Missouri.
Yeah, I think the optimism at Missouri should be, Blake Baker turned out to be a pretty good hire. I was kind of skeptical because Miami's defense was not very good last year, and it's worked out well for Missouri. Also, I think what they've been able to do through the portal on defense, making that group deeper across the board, feels like they got more depth. I think that side of the ball looks like it's trending in the right direction. But Missouri's got to figure out its offense. I mean, when you look at their stat sheet this year, they're averaging about 18 points a game in SEC contests. I mean, that's just not enough margin for error in these games. Also, just struggling to get any kind of big plays, just any kind of drive to drive consistency. So a lot of this to me is on the offensive line. They rank last in the SEC in tackles for loss allowed, and of course that hurts the run game too. So I think going forward for me, for Missouri, it's you got to solve the offensive line. You've got to get the quarterback position figured out. You got to figure out a way to generate more big plays. We've talked about Connor Wigman for A&M, but at some point this year, I think if you're Eli Drinkowitz, I think you have to get Sam Horn involved in some way, and you got to start figuring out if he's the guy for 2023 or what you need out of the portal next year.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever told you this, Stephen, but I was told that JT Daniels decided not to go to Missouri because of that offensive line. And that has, unfortunately for the Tigers, come to fruition because I got to think they'd be a hell of a lot better team with JT Daniels there under center.
I agree with you. Yeah, I think they'd be in a lot better shape. I mean, Missouri Vanderbilt had 11 tackles for a loss on Saturday, which if Vanderbilt's defense is not exactly one of the better defenses in the SEC, and also a third of Missouri's rushing yards have basically came against Louisiana Tech this year. So I mean, they've really got a couple areas they've got to figure out. Like, yes, the quarterback position hasn't been consistent enough. They're not getting enough out of Brady Cook. It was kind of the knock on Connor Bazelak was that it was efficiency, that the mid-range stuff was there, but not the long passes, the big plays that you need. And they're still dealing with that this year. So some of that's offensive line, some of that's quarterback. They kind of go hand in hand. But I also think that they've got to solve and find the next guy at quarterback. And I think that might be Sam Horn. But we need to see him at some point this year, I think, to be able to kind of judge for 2023 and beyond.
Yeah, and you kind of already hit on this, but do you think when Missouri's on defense and South Carolina has the ball, that Missouri is at an advantage with that matchup?
I think that's probably a pretty even matchup because South Carolina. I mean, just despite winning the game, South Carolina only had 286 total yards against A&M. I mean, you got to find ways to win if you're South Carolina with a struggling offense, and they did that. But I think you'd like to see more than 286 yards. It really brings down that margin for error in some of these games. So I think if you're Missouri, the optimism ought to be last week South Carolina was outgained, but they found a way to win. And I think Missouri's defense can get enough stops here. Can you make a play or two on special teams? Can you maybe score on defense? The spread's only 5 here. This feels like a very close, low-scoring game. So something like that, a mistake, getting South Carolina into third and long, create some negative plays would be a real plus for Missouri because they're probably going to struggle to score.
Yeah, and you talk about the South Carolina staff, Stephen, doing such a good job. We got to credit Shane Beamer with the Beamer ball, but Pete Limbo, the special teams coordinator, could you make the case that he is maybe the most valuable assistant coach in the SEC this year?
I think you could. I think Shane Beamer being a first-time head coach, Pete Limbo has coaching experience from Ball State and a couple other places, and just having that, inside knowledge, running a program, being a veteran guy who they can bounce ideas off is probably really valuable for a first-time head coach. In South Carolina, they're just so close in terms of they don't really have an explosive offense. Their defense is getting better, but that they're probably going to play a lot of close games. So you need to find a way to manufacture a couple plays to steal a victory here and there. And the way they started that game on Saturday night is kind of a case study in this. They were able to score. They blocked punts this year that changed games. So I mean, Pete Limbo and Shane Beamer are doing really nice work this year on special teams.
All right, final question I got for you, Stephen. I really appreciate all your time. A little off the wall, but I meant to ask you this on a previous episode, and I always forget. Steve Sarkisian just lost another one. It was to a good Oklahoma State team. We'll give him that. But Steve Sarkisian, Brent Venables, who's off to a horrible start at Oklahoma. What are the odds? I guess 0 out of 100. What are the odds that Sarkisian and Venables are coaching in the SEC when Oklahoma and Texas make that transition?
Man, I think it's pretty high that both are on the sidelines when they move to the SEC. I mean, there was some reporting
as Alabama analysts.
Right.
No,
yes. Yeah. That's a great point. No, I think they'll both be head coaches. I think Oklahoma is going to be pretty patient with Brent Venables. They underwent a lot of roster turnover this offseason, as evidenced by Spencer Rattler at South Carolina, Caleb Williams over at USC. His contract's also pretty much, they gave him pretty good deal as far as guarantees. Be hard to move on, I think, from him after 2 years. I hate to say this, but I think Texas is moving in the right direction. I don't want to get old takes, freezing cold takes here. I do think they are moving in the right direction, and they've recruited better on the offensive and defensive lines, which is what they're going to need to do to win the SEC. So last year was a struggle at the end of the year. Fourth quarter collapses. We've seen that again, but it does feel like they're getting better. Maybe ask me midway through 2023, and I'll have a different answer for you.
All right, Stephen. Once again, I really appreciate all your time. Can you tell the audience before you leave where to find all your outstanding work?
Absolutely. You can check out my writings on athlonsports.com. You can follow me on Twitter at AthlonSteven. We have our Twitter space every Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern time. Would love for anyone to stop by, 11 a.m. Eastern time, myself and Braden Gall. And also, you can check me out on my YouTube page, All CFB 365.
Yeah, that Twitter Spaces, I was on it this morning. They get some wild questions on there, some great information. It's a must listen week in and week out. But thanks again, Stephen. Really appreciated it.
Thanks for having me on, Mike. Anytime.